no confusions, no tumult, end quote. And James Otis said that, quote, no possible circumstances, though ever so oppressive, could be supposed sufficient to justify private tumults and disorders, end quote. So no circumstances, no matter how oppressive, are sufficient to justify a private tumult. How dare you riot? Don't riot and cause disorder. Impressment and the quartering of troops by the British were directly hurtful to the sailors and other working people. After 1768, 2,000 soldiers were quartered in Boston, and friction grew between the crowds and the soldiers. The soldiers began to take the jobs of working people when jobs were scarce. Mechanics and shopkeepers lost work or business because of the colonists' boycott of British goods. In 1769, Boston set up a committee, quote, to consider of some suitable methods of employing the poor of the town, whose numbers and distresses are daily increasing by the loss of its trade and commerce, end quote. On March 5, 1770, grievances of rope makers against British soldiers taking their jobs led to a fight. A crowd gathered in front of the custom house and began provoking the soldiers, who fired and killed first Crispus Attucks, a mulatto worker, then others. This became known as the Boston Massacre. Feelings against the British mounted quickly. There was anger at the acquittal of 6 of the British soldiers. 2 were punished by having their thumbs branded and were discharged from the army. The crowd at the massacre was described by John Adams, defense attorney for the British soldiers, as, quote, a motley rabble of saucy boys, Negroes and mulattoes, Irish teagues, and outlandish jack-tars, end quote. Perhaps 10,000 people marched in the funeral procession for the victims of the massacre out of a total Boston population of 16,000. So over half of Boston's population marched in the funeral procession due to that massacre. This led England to remove the troops from Boston and try to quiet the situation. Impressment was the background of the massacre. There had been impressment riots through the 1760s in New York and in Newport, Rhode Island, where 500 seamen, boys, and Negroes rioted after 5 weeks of impressment by the British. 6 weeks before the Boston Massacre, there was a battle in New York of seamen against British soldiers taking their jobs, and 1 seaman was killed. So, once again, we had people getting murdered in the streets by ridiculous levels of nonsense. The soldiers and other military types who had caused the problem were not very adequately punished, and you had people marching in the streets over it. Once again, over 250 years ago. Funny that. In the Boston Tea Party of December 1773, the Boston Committee of Correspondence, formed a year before to organize anti-British actions, quote, control cloud action against the tea from the start, end quote, Dick Herder says. The Tea Party led to the coercive acts by Parliament, virtually establishing martial law in Massachusetts, dissolving the colonial government, closing the port in Boston, and sending in troops. Still, town meetings and mass meetings rose in opposition. The seizure of a powder store by the British led 4,000 men from all around Boston to assemble in Cambridge, where some of the wealthy officials had their sumptuous homes. The crowd forced the officials to resign. The committees of correspondence of Boston and other towns welcomed this gathering, but warned against destroying private property. Pauline Maier, who studied the development of opposition to Britain in the decade before 1776 in her book From Resistance to Revolution, emphasizes the moderation of the leadership and, despite their desire for resistance, their, quote, emphasis on order and restraint, end quote. She notes, quote, the officers and committee members of the Sons of Liberty were drawn almost entirely from the middle and upper classes of colonial society, end quote. In Newport, Rhode Island, for instance, the Sons of Liberty, according to a contemporary writer, quote, contained some gentlemen of the first figure in town for opulence, sense, and politeness, end quote. In North Carolina, quote, one of the wealthiest of the gentlemen and freeholders, end quote, led the Sons of Liberty. Similarly, in Virginia and South Carolina. And, quote, New York leaders, too, were involved in small but respectable independent business ventures, end quote. Their aim, however, was to broaden their organization, to develop a mass base of wage earners. Many of the Sons of Liberty groups declared, as in Milford, Connecticut, their, quote, greatest abhorrence, end quote, of lawlessness, or, as in Annapolis, opposed, quote, all riots or unlawful assemblies tending to the disturbance of the public tranquility. End quote. John Adams expressed the same fears. Quote, these tarrings and featherings, this breaking open houses by rude and insolent rabbles, in resentment for private wrongs, or in pursuing of private prejudices and passions, must be discountenanced. End quote. In Virginia, it seemed clear to the educated gentry that something needed to be done to persuade the lower orders to join the revolutionary cause, to deflect their anger against England. One Virginian wrote in his diary in the spring of 1774, quote, the lower class of people here are in tumult on account of reports from Boston. Many of them expect to be pressed and compelled to go and fight the Britons. End quote. Around the time of the Stamp Act, a Virginia orator addressed the poor. Quote, are not the gentlemen made of the same materials as the lowest and poorest among you? Listen to no doctrines which may tend to divide us, but let us go hand in hand as brothers. End quote. It was a problem for which the rhetorical talents of Patrick Henry were superbly fitted. He was, as Rice Isaac puts it, quote, firmly attached to the world of the gentry, end quote, but he spoke in words that the poorer whites of Virginia could understand. Henry's fellow Virginian, Edmund Randolph, recalled his style as, quote, simplicity and even carelessness. His pauses, which for their length might sometimes be feared to dispel the attention, riveted it the more by raising the expectation, end quote. Patrick Henry's oratory in Virginia pointed a way to relieve class tension between upper and lower classes and form a bond against the British. This was to find language inspiring to all classes, specific enough in its listing of grievances to charge people with anger against the British, vague enough to avoid class conflict among the rebels, and stirring enough to build patriotic feeling for the resistance movement. Tom Paine's Common Sense, which appeared in early 1776 and became the most popular pamphlet in the American colonies, did this. It made the first bold argument for independence in words that any fairly literate person could understand. Quote, society in every state is a blessing, but government even in its best state is but a necessary evil. End quote. Paine disposed of the idea of the divine right of kings by a pungent history of the British monarchy, going back to the Norman conquest of 1066, when William the Conqueror came over from France to set himself on the British throne. Quote, a French bastard landing with an armed bandits and establishing himself King of England against the consent of the natives is, in plain terms, a very paltry, rascally original. It certainly has no divinity in it. End quote. Paine dealt with the practical advantages of sticking to England or being separated. He knew the importance of economics. Quote, I challenge the honest advocate for reconciliation to show a single advantage that this continent can reap by being connected with Great Britain. I repeat the challenge. Not a single advantage is derived. Our corn will fetch its price in any market in Europe, and our imported goods must be paid for by them where we will. End quote. As for the bad effects of the connection with England, Paine appealed to the colonists and colonial memory of all the wars in which England had involved them, wars costly in lives and money. Quote, but the injuries and the disadvantages which we sustain by that connection are without number. Any submission to or dependence on Great Britain tends directly to involve this continent in European wars and quarrels and set us at variance with nations who would otherwise seek our friendship. End quote. He built